In 1949, Thurgood Marshall, the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, turned to his 31-year-old special counsel, an obscure New York lawyer named Franklin Hall Williams, to assist in a case involving 4 young black men in Groveland, Florida, who were falsely accused of raping a white woman. One of the suspects was hunted down in a swamp and killed by a posse. 2 were taken out on a desolate road and shot by the sheriff, one fatally. The survivors were convicted by an all-white jury on the strength of false confessions that resulted from torture. All were innocent. But their innocence was of no consequence in 1949 in the Deep South. A white jury could simply never credit the word of a black man over that of a white girl. It was socially and politically unthinkable. Franklin Williams quickly found himself thrown into the middle of a cultural and legal minefield.
The irony is, at least to me, how very few people knew about Franklin Williams. I mean, across the board, he was not a quote-unquote famous person. But when you look at his life, you realize how much of an impact this man had.
Throughout his lifetime, he would play many roles: attorney, civil rights leader, organizer of the Peace Corps, diplomat, United Nations representative, and foundation president. Later in life, he chaired the first court-based commission in the United States that focused on racial and ethnic fairness in the courts, a commission that later became the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission.
In war, you don't remember the name of all the brigadier generals. You remember the 4-star generals and the 3-star generals and the 5-star general, but you don't remember the 1-star generals. Well, it's that kind of thing. You know, maybe he was a 1-star general who managed to win a few battles over here and a few battles over there.
Clearly, Franklin was not Martin Luther King. I think that he worked with a much smaller palette.
It's important to understand that the civil rights movement wasn't all marches, and it wasn't all speeches by eloquent people, and it wasn't all mass movements. I think people played different roles and different parts in that struggle. From the first slave that ever ran away to people who were bridge figures like Franklin, who could easily move in white society.
Franklin Williams was born October 22, 1917, in Flushing, Queens. His ancestors included Native Americans, black freemen, runaway slaves, Dutch and English immigrants, and even black slave owners. Franklin lived in a house with 18 people from 4 generations of family representing every shade imaginable. His mother, Alinda Lowry Williams, would die before Franklin celebrated his 2nd birthday. His father was a traveling musician named Arthur Williams, who had been banished from the household by Alinda's father, Thaddeus Lowry. Franklin and his 2 older brothers were raised by their grandfather in those early years.
His grandfather, Thaddeus, used to say that Frankie sucked the air out of the room when he walked into it. I guess we'd call it charisma now. His grandfather came from a family of slave-owning blacks in Virginia. And Thad Lowry was a very arrogant man who adored his grandchildren and his children. And so there was a community of black kids who lived not far from Franklin, and he wasn't allowed to play with them. So it wasn't a matter of color. It was a matter of his grandfather saying, you have enough, you can play with your cousins. You don't have to go play with those kids. Those kids are not good enough for you. So the color didn't come until he was an adolescent, and then it hit hard.
One of the incidents that I think started his desire for justice was he was in a scouting type organization through his high school, and one day they all wanted to go to the local pool, and got there, and they said, "You can't come in. You're not allowed in here," you know. And he understood, and everyone else understood why everybody else in the group was white, and they wouldn't let him in. And he went home and cried. And I think that sort of started him thinking about justice for African Americans.
Carolyn Robertson was his very good friend, and he used to go ice skating with Carolyn Robertson and other kids in the park in the wintertime. And somebody got the idea one evening that they should go to the movies. And it was wonderful, and they had a good time. And when they walked out of the movie, Mr. Robertson was there waiting. And they took Franklin and threw him up against the wall. And they said, "You stick to your own kind. And if I ever see you with my daughter again, I will call the police." Now that came as a tremendous shock to him because he had grown up with this kid. They had not minded him playing with her when he was 10 and 11. But the minute he turned 13 or 14, that became what it became, and he was devastated by that.
By the time Thaddeus Lowry had passed away, the Queens home Franklin grew up in was a distant memory. And with America then in the grips of the Great Depression, he worked a number of jobs to make ends meet while finishing high school. But he never lost sight of his goal to attend college. While he was busy scraping together some savings for tuition, a neighbor and close family friend, Dr. May Edward Chen, the first African-American woman to graduate from Bellevue Hospital Medical School, offered to help. The daughter of an escaped slave, Dr. Chen was Franklin's godmother. With his path clear to attend college, Franklin enrolled in Lincoln University, the first degree-granting black college in 1937.
Lincoln said, "You know, you don't really have to be black here. You can be Franklin." He learned about equality. He learned about accepting people for who they were and not from whence they came. And I think it shaped him in terms of justice.
After graduating cum laude from Lincoln in 1941 with a degree in philosophy, Franklin enrolled in Fordham Law School. But his schooling was interrupted by World War II. At Fort Dix, the white soldiers were assigned to nice facilities while the blacks stood at attention in the mud and rain until they were marched miles away and put in tents with no floors and no electricity.
He hated the Army, and the Army hated him.
He realized that he, as a black man, regardless of how smart everybody thought he was, regardless of how powerful he was as a personality, regardless of his leadership skills, regardless of his family background, that he was thought of as less than the most ignorant white man. That just sat in his craw in a way that he couldn't accept.
Coming from a multiracial family, Franklin had some self-identification issues. He tells a story where he was taking a train trip on a segregated train, and he got to the train, and where does he go? He goes to the colored area, and conductors won't let him in because they think he's Mexican. And then he goes to the white area, and the conductors think he's trying to pass for white, and they send him away. And so he ends up back in the color section, and by this time, the area is full. There's no place to sit. The toilet is not functioning, it's backing up. And for 2 days, he had to sit on the floor using his duffel bag as his pillow in sewage coming from a malfunctioning toilet. And of course, the place was never cleaned because this was the colored car where people were treated as less than human. This caused Franklin to have a nervous breakdown. But bringing Franklin Williams, it also was an opportunity for him to grow, to get to know himself, to get involved in things that mattered, to change things, especially after he met Shirley and Thurgood Marshall.
Soon after his discharge, Franklin met and married the former Shirley Broyard. A native of New Orleans, Shirley would become Franklin's rock, his conscience, his intellectual equal, and then some. Franklin passed the New York State Bar exam in 1945 and quickly found himself working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York City as assistant counsel to Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court.
He was at the NAACP for less than a year when he wrote this 5-page memo to Thurgood Marshall pointing out that the office was run in a sloppy manner, that things weren't organized, that people were squeezed into spaces that were too small to allow them to do their best work. And the tone of it was really arrogant. And I can imagine that Thurgood did not appreciate this whippersnapper, so to speak, pointing out all the flaws of his management style. So I don't think that endeared Franklin to Thurgood at all.
One of his first NAACP matters involved a decorated and uniformed African-American World War II veteran named Isaac Woodard, Jr. After honorably serving his country, Sergeant Woodard was on his way home to reunite with his wife when he made the mistake of talking back to a white bus driver, something a black man just didn't do in the South. A police officer in Batesburg, South Carolina, punished Sergeant Woodard with a nightstick, rupturing both eyeballs and blinding him for life. The blinding of Isaac Woodard seemed to open America's eyes to racial injustice, and Isaac and Franklin went on a nationwide speaking tour, raising money and awareness. They appeared with former heavyweight champion Joe Louis at Louis-owned Stadium, drawing 20,000 people and raising $22,000. Franklin was so successful that he was enlisted to do other fundraising tours for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund with African-American celebrities such as Jackie Robinson. Jackie, and then his widow Rachel, became lifelong friends of the Williams family. In 1949, Thurgood Marshall sent Franklin to Groveland, Florida, to defend the young men wrongly accused of rape, and Franklin became the first black lawyer ever to sit on a legal team in any Lake County courtroom. In that case, he was exposed to coerced confessions, mob violence complicit with local law enforcement, and was literally chased out of town by a lynch mob, barely escaping with his life.
There were riots. They bombed a civil rights activist's home. And he saw this. He was part of this. He was brave enough to defend these young men and did this throughout the South, by the way. So this was not just someone who spoke civil rights. This is someone who put his life on the line for civil rights.
One of the lawyers on the case was a young, idealistic, and totally inexperienced recent law school graduate named Jack Greenberg, who went on to have an illustrious career as a civil rights attorney and scholar. Greenberg succeeded Thurgood Marshall as Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
The immediate issues facing us were the confessions that the defendants were supposed to have made. And they claimed, well, shown very easily, have been beaten and tortured to make these confessions. And so we had to somehow invalidate them so that they were not to be believed. They cannot be admitted into evidence.
The trial was a travesty, and the jury would find all the defendants guilty. 2 of them were sentenced to die in the electric chair. However, Franklin convinced the Supreme Court to reverse the convictions and order a new trial. Although he had not previously been involved in the case, Thurgood Marshall decided that he, not Franklin, would handle what was shaping up as a nationally followed retrial. Franklin was transferred to California.
Thurgood was a very measured man. He would not take any case to the Supreme Court that he did not determine beyond a reasonable doubt, is how he put it, that the court would decide in his favor, in favor of the case that was argued by Thurgood. Franklin was much more aggressive. He wanted to take any injustice case to the Supreme Court. And Thurgood, particularly at the time, understood that while the case may be deserving of going to the Supreme Court, if you're not going to win, you're going to have a setback because that case is going to be precedent. and he would only take cases that he was absolutely sure he could win. Franklin was, as I said, far more aggressive. He actually wanted to take over the NAACP when Thurgood was going to leave. Thurgood got wind of that and said, you know, I'm still around, and you know, you can collect your paycheck as you leave.
They were both brilliant men, but they had different ideas about how things should be handled. Thurgood was a gradualist. He wanted to nick over here and nick over there, and Dad wanted to bowl ahead and take the chance, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. It's a matter of style, but both very bullheaded, both very strong-willed, and it's difficult to have two people like that working in the same office at the same time. And Thurgood was in charge, so at some point after the Groveland case, he just said, Frank, I think I'd like you to go out to the West Coast so we're not beating each other up.
In California, Franklin prospered, and so did the NAACP under his leadership. He was instrumental in building the NAACP in the western third of the country and won the first school desegregation case.
According to Jack Greenberg, who I interviewed and who I agree with, he was the most riveting speaker ever. He was eloquent and elegant in his use of language, and it was like poetry to listen to him.
Apartheid is a grand design, in short, of the South African government to denationalize, to deny citizenship rights and privileges to 90 to 95% of the black population.
Franklin's growing prominence and reasoned approach brought him to the attention of President Kennedy. And in 1961, he was invited to join the administration at the newly established Peace Corps.
No country wanted Peace Corps volunteers. Every country felt that they were CIA covers and that it was just some kind of dishonest ploy one way or the other. Franklin was able to go to Ghana and speak to the president, who was Kwame Nkrumah, who was his old buddy from Lincoln University. So the first group of Peace Corps kids went to Ghana. And then after they did so well, then other countries wanted them. So Franklin was very key in the organization of the Peace Corps in its inception.
A few years later, President Johnson asked his Solicitor General, Thurgood Marshall, for his candid opinion on whether Franklin was suitable to replace Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, as head of the Peace Corps.
Can I tell you something about your discussing it with a human?
Why, certainly.
What would you think about his taking Shriver's place at the Peace Corps?
Terrific. I would put Frank there without any hesitation because he can come up with more ideas in a minute than most people I know of, and they're darn good ones. I think from there he'll drive like mad, and he'll drive everybody under him too, because he puts in a real day's work. He's terrific. I think he'd be good. Yes, sir.
He never took over the Peace Corps, but President Johnson did appoint him in 1965 to ambassador to Ghana. And I think it was because of his relationship with Nkrumah that he forged it at Lincoln. Not long after he arrived, there was a coup. President Nkrumah was overthrown, and some people, including President Nkrumah, thought that Ambassador Williams was part of it, that he helped overthrow the government, that he was sent there to betray his old classmate. Ambassador Williams was devastated that anyone would think that of him. And in later years, he was vindicated, and it was determined that he was not involved in all with the coup. And while he carried around that pain, he worked so hard to improve the relationships between the United States and Ghana, so much so that Secretary of State Dean Russ honored him with the Distinguished Service Award.
Upon his return from Ghana in 1968, Franklin was selected to head a new urban center at Columbia University, which resulted in major curriculum changes. Later, he became president of the Phelps-Stokes Fund, which was dedicated to improving the education of American blacks, Africans, and American Indians.
When we were at Phelps-Stokes, he persuaded the foundation's board to divest itself of holdings and corporations that did business with South Africa. At that time, South Africa was ruled by a white minority. They perpetuated the racially segregated policies of apartheid. Not long after these investments were pulled by the Phelps-Stokes board, other foundations and institutions began following suit.
But he grew increasingly discouraged over the slow pace of civil rights and concerned with the violent approach of the Black Power movement.
Franklin had a lot of trouble with militant blacks. Franklin was not militant. Franklin felt that he was proud to be an American. Franklin felt that the system, that evils that had happened in the past were slowly working themselves out. Franklin felt that education and Western civilization and knowledge and learning were important. He also was big on form. He didn't like people shouting and clenching fists.
While Franklin was at Phelps Stokes, New York Chief Judge Saul Wachtler was increasingly embarrassed and troubled by the lack of diversity in the judicial system.
Chief Judge Saul Wachtler was pretty much at the beginning of his term as Chief Judge, and this was in the late 1980s. And he took the opportunity to visit the trial courts and was dismayed and quite frankly shocked at what he saw, and which was an absence of diversity among the judges, among the court personnel, and also inadequate facilities in courthouses that provided services to the poor. And he decided to do something about it.
I don't think that there are many people in the history of the civil rights movement who could match his credentials, qualifications, and abilities. So I called him up. I remember calling him from my house in Albany, and cold call. And I introduced myself, and I told him at length what I was thinking about and concerned with, and asked whether he would undertake the chairmanship of it. And his first answer, and I noticed that this is quoted in the Ultimate Commission report, his answer was, you know, when you start digging into this problem, you're going to create wounds, and wounds that can't be covered over or cured with a Band-Aid. I said, I understand that. I said, that's why I want you to do it. I said, I want someone who is not going to be a company man.
Franklin Williams was the obvious choice because he had the credibility, the strength to do it, and yet he was not a rock thrower. That was not Franklin Williams. He was not someone who was yelling and screaming. That was not him in the slightest. Demeanor, distinguished demeanor, called it the way he saw it, but not, what you might call, a rabble-rouser. That just wasn't his nature.
With the facts in hand, the Commission's task was to produce a no-holds-barred report. Its report, highly critical of the way the New York State court system treated minorities, shocked the judiciary to the very top and resulted in permanent reforms.
There is always a need to monitor. There is always a need to examine. There's always a need to understand the treatment of minorities, the placement of minorities within work positions. He brought people together, disparate groups, but he did it in a way where he allowed them to analyze and to recognize deficiencies. And when you have people of all sorts participating in attempting to resolve something, you're going to have a much stronger resolution than just picking and choosing those who have a certain opinion.
Franklin passed away in 1990, a year short of the publication of the Minority Report, which he worked so diligently on with the rest of the commission members. He built a bridge for us, not through violence or animosity, but by reason and example. That bridge still exists, and we are all still walking across that bridge to fairness and equity in the courts. And that's why the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission exists and continues to exist, so that we will continue to see his good work in our lives.
From the outset, the commission was one of our few permanent commissions because the area of responsibility for the members of the commission is so important and fundamental to running a fair and just court system and ensuring the principles and the decency that were Franklin Williams.
We don't have all of the problems resolved about race in the justice system or in this state or in this country, but we do know, and I believe that the legacy of the Williams Commission is that this is something that you can't hide from. I believe that Ambassador Williams, being the kind of character that he was, looked for it, found it, and we're all the better for it.
I think he would want to be remembered as someone who worked hard at the goal that he had set for himself. He knew he couldn't do everything. It just took too many people to accomplish everything. I think he wants to be remembered as someone who shot for the stars and maybe only made it to the moon, but that's a significant accomplishment and it's in the right direction.